Welcome to episode 52 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian for 13 years, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that the ideas expressed in this podcast by myself and my guests do not reflect those of our district. When incorporating research, I always cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast is something for you. I'd like to extend a very special welcome this week to listeners Megan in Texas, Erica in Tennessee, Judy in Arizona, Michelle in Florida, Kelly, Patrick, and Chelsea in Michigan, Rachel in Massachusetts, and Janelle in Georgia. Listener Holly in Georgia wrote me an email, and I asked if I could share this with you today. Holly wrote, I am going into my 4th year as a school library media specialist at a large school south of Atlanta, over 1,000 K-5 students. While I have been successful in my career, I still feel inadequate as a school librarian because I was not in a classroom before getting my master's in media. I worked previously as a paraprofessional, academic lab manager, a technology specialist, and a children's pastor. While I'm not new to education, I still feel like I'm not fully prepared because of my lack of classroom experience. And I responded right away to Holly because I could relate to it on so many levels. While I had plenty of teaching experience, it was at a different grade level. I taught high school for 10 years and found myself working in an elementary school when my only experience had been basically being a parent of small children and, again, Sunday school, I think I might have mentioned at some point. And so I've decided to share this with you now because while it could be an entire episode on its own, it might still become an episode at some point. I did want to be able to give Holly some suggestions in the meanwhile. So I've been there, done that when it comes to feeling just completely uninformed when it comes to best practices because I was finding myself teaching at a different grade level. So here is the advice I gave to Holly that night. First of all, identify the grade level which you have the biggest challenges. Speak to those teachers and be direct. Explain what you need to happen in their class visits when they come to the library. Hopefully, you can start to incorporate those strategies into the library visits for consistency. Also, ask your administration if you could do some observations. My district permits a full day of instructional rounds where teachers can shadow teachers who have more experience working at a particular grade level. Rather than shadowing school librarians, I would suggest observing classroom teachers in the grade you happen to find most challenging. I also recommended trying out TeacherTube on the internet. There are some mentor videos, and while I haven't watched many of them, we sometimes use those to kickstart a professional development meeting, and I found them to be at least a good way to get an idea, a visual of what's going on in classrooms. There are also some teacher-focused podcasts. I would recommend Jennifer Gonzalez's Cult to Pedagogy. There's another one I've listened to a little bit called Teachers Need Teachers. And, those are helpful because you hear a lot about classroom-specific challenges. I also suggested to fall back on your department as a good source for strategies, and don't be concerned about changing strategies or starting new approaches in the hopes of arriving at a better outcome. I know I've mentioned that before in the episode. It's not unusual for me to decide we're just going to try doing things a little differently because whatever we're doing right now isn't working. And my last piece of advice to Holly was to focus your efforts on one aspect of your day that you want to try and change, and not to try some sort of large-scale overhaul that could be really consuming, but to focus on one aspect at a time. I'd like to welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions, either on Facebook, Twitter, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I will be sure to send you a podcast sticker. And now, for today's episode on Schoolwide Culture of Reading, I am very excited to share my conversation with Melissa Thom. No doubt some of you have come across her posts on Twitter. I've always been intrigued and impressed with Melissa's ideas, and I think listeners will agree. Please be sure to visit our show notes. I made sure to include all the links to everything mentioned in our conversation, so sit back, relax, and hear all about building school-wide culture of reading. All right, hey listeners, I have a wonderful treat today. I have an opportunity to speak with Melissa Thom, and I have been excited about this for quite some time, ever since I started following her on social media. And Melissa Thom brings a great deal of expertise when it comes to developing school-wide culture of reading. And so I'm really excited about today's conversation. So Melissa, would you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about AASL and your home from your conference?
Yeah, thank you. It's so nice to be here. So I have been a librarian for 5 years. I was a classroom teacher for 12 before moving into the library, and I am in a middle school right now. And last weekend, I was very fortunate to be able to attend AASL in Louisville. I still can't say it correctly.
Louisville.
Thank you. Yes, there was even phonetic spelling all around the city, and it didn't help. And we actually had about 30 people from Connecticut, so we had a really strong showing. It was amazing. And I was asked by Mackin to be one of their presenters in the exhibit hall at their booth. So I was able to, for 10 minutes twice, talk a little bit about school-wide culture of reading and share it with some of the attendees there. And there were just so many amazing presenters and authors and experiences. I'm really excited for the videos that they recorded, some of the sessions to come out, because there's a lot that I did not get to see in person.
Well, as somebody who was hashtag not at AASL, there was a considerable amount of FOMO. On the other hand, I have been doing my best to schedule some of that talent to speak on the podcast. So for those of us who were not so fortunate to be able to attend, I am rounding up and scheduling interviews hopefully so that the rest of us who didn't get to go will still benefit from their expertise. I was really interested. I noticed you were a finalist in this year's AASL Reader Leader. And for those of us who don't know what that is, that recognition identifies a school librarian who, quote, effectively uses one or more social media channels to highlight authors and literature and exemplify collection development, end quote. Could you tell our listeners what it is about you and your library program which attracted the attention of the committee?
Yeah, I think part of it is definitely I have a very active presence on Twitter. I think that Twitter is one of my most powerful professional learning networks, and I connect on a daily basis with other librarians from around the country, and I promote all of the stuff that's happening in my library. I talk about the books that we're reading, and if a student comes to me that has just really loved a book that they've finished, I will tweet about it. I'll tag the author, and 90% of the time that author will respond, and it gets a conversation going, and it just brings that experience of connecting with a real live author to my student who may or may not have ever had the opportunity to meet somebody who's written a book in person. And I also attend a lot of different events throughout the year through School Library Journal, through AASL. I go to the ALA events. And it's very funny. Often I will find a person that I have only known on the Twitter sphere, and I will meet them in life for the first time. And it's like we already know each other. I just think it's a really amazing tool to connect with people that you don't always get to interact with, especially those authors and publishers around the country. So that's what, and one of the other things that I had started to do last year is make my Facebook more professional. I know a lot of people use their Facebook kind of for their personal life and maybe Twitter or Instagram for their professional life. And I've just really transformed my Facebook also because I find that there's a different audience on Facebook in the book community and the writing community that I want to reach also with both what I'm doing and getting ideas from those people.
Well, and I've noticed something sort of consistent talking to you and a couple other guests on the podcast, that when we demonstrate responsible use of the internet and social media in the context of our students, I think that that's some very, real life experience that you become the model, and they realize that there is the way to use the internet for good,
Oh my gosh. Can I just share a really quick anecdote
Absolutely,
about that?
Please do.
Because I do believe that. I believe that there are so many negative examples out in the world today with social media that students aren't getting enough of the positive, because we want to protect them. And in effect, we just shield them and they never learn how to properly use it, like you just said. Mm-hmm. But I have a group of students. I have two 8th graders now. When they were 6th graders, one of them created a book blog. It's called Page Turner Kids, and you can find them online at Page Turner Kids, and then pageturnerkids.com. And I became their PR person this year as 8th graders. They really wanted to develop the website, and kind of they hit the ground running at the beginning of the year. So I said, well, one of the ways that I always get out what I'm doing with my professional life is I use Twitter. And since they were 8th graders in school, didn't have their own accounts, I said, I will create an account for you and I will be your PR manager. So I created the account. They could log in if they wanted to look at it, and I would just start tweeting. And when they would post a review, I would model how I would tag the author. I would use hashtags. I would put it out to people that I wanted to be my audience. And about probably 2 months into this whole project, I was at home and I saw a notification on my phone that there was a new Twitter message from Page Turner Kids, and I was like, I didn't post that. So I went and looked, and one of the 8th graders created the most amazing post, better than I could have even done, and even had a GIF that he had created about his latest upcoming book review that had been posted on their website. And I have now I don't need to do their posting for them anymore, because they learned from the model, and they've had authors follow them. They have comments. They've had conversations via their Twitter page, and they have reached out to publishers to try to get books to review before they come out. So that was just one kind of small example that started out really easy. And I've just been so amazed at kind of where it's taken a life of its own.
Well, and you mentioned the age of your students, because I think all too often when you don't have that opportunity to intercept them before they become, teenagers, this is far more impactful to them because they are an eager audience, and they haven't necessarily had quite the opportunity to do a lot of posting, perhaps on Twitter. Maybe I'm very wrong, but I really
well, at
do
least
think
positive posting.
Exactly, and I do think using it. I think what I find very exciting, because I've recently had some success with authors getting back to me about my students' artwork that I posted on social media, is that especially for districts who cannot afford to fly somebody in, a guest author, somebody who, and Skyping is great. Sometimes Skyping an author still costs money. And I'm aware of authors who, out of necessity do charge for their Skype meetings. And I think that when kids get this kind of interpersonal sort of networking with real authors, it legitimates what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And it really does validate it, and it doesn't cost any money.
No, it's amazing. There's so many opportunities. And I'll throw in one other Twitter connection that not everybody out there might know about, but I think 2 years ago is when it started. There's a hashtag, and it's called Kids Need Mentors. Have you heard of that before?
Honestly, I'm aware of it only because I follow you on social media.
So very briefly, it was created by 4 authors, and they saw a need to connect authors more directly with librarians or teachers. And at the beginning of the school year, maybe it's in the summertime, there is a Google form that goes out, and I found it via Twitter, and you fill it out with where you teach and what level you work with, and then you will be paired up with an author. And that person becomes kind of your mentor, that you and that person work together that year to do whatever it is you want to do. So it can be a little bit or it could be a whole lot. So I did that 2 years ago, got put on a waiting list, and now this year I am paired up with an author. So Sarah Littman is the person that is connected to my school, and we're doing a 7th grade book group with one of her titles. We're going to have her come in with 8th grade and talk about some writing things. She does a variety of things within her writing life that's beyond books, and it's just an amazing connection. And again, it's free.
And you said it's hashtag kids need mentors?
Yes. Correct.
Okay. All right. We're learning as we go. Thank you very much. Well, and I think that's really terrific because, again, for districts who have a modest budget, that's a really great solution. And again, it means a great deal to students that they make those kinds of connections with authors.
Yes.
So, you mentioned that you've been a school librarian for 5 years and you were a teacher beforehand. Could you tell us about your current library program, because I'm always excited to hear about our different configurations and what we do.
Yeah, so I am in a middle school and we have students in grades 6 through 8. We have about 400 students or so, and we are in West Hartford, which is a suburb of Hartford. I've been there for 5 years, as you've mentioned, and I have a completely flexible schedule. So I do a lot of collaboration across content levels. I have a very active, I have a couple different groups that are very active in my library. So I do a lot with involving students and putting them into roles of leadership in the spreading of culture of reading. A couple of the things we have currently going on is we participate in something called KidLit Quiz. Mm-hmm. And it is an international competition, and it just so happens that the national contest takes place in Connecticut. I don't know the history of that. I didn't know about,
or does it rotate?
It's always. And I don't know why, because the creator of KidLit Quiz is from New Zealand, and he comes and he moderates. There's 2 heats, and then the top teams from each heat go on to the finals. And whoever wins the finals for the U.S. competition goes this summer to New Zealand. And it's a different place every year. One year it was Toronto. I think one year it was Singapore. And it is literally a competition of trivia all about children's literature.
Wow. So listeners, we'll put a link in the show notes. If we can, we'll find it and
absolutely.
And share it with you in the show notes. That's fantastic. Yes.
Oh my gosh, it's so much fun. And so this is my 3rd year doing it. We have 4 teams. Students have to be, I think, between the ages of 10 and 13. So some 8th graders are eligible, but most aren't, because you have to be 13 still in July when the world competition would happen. But it's something that even though you might not be able to do the competition because you do not live near Connecticut and it wouldn't be feasible, you can completely create your own within district and even within a state if you felt so inclined. It's just a lot of fun. Wow. Something else that I do is I do book crew is what it's called, and that is in conjunction with my book fair. So I do 2 scholastic book fairs a year, and last spring was the first time I officially did book crew. I had, I think, 16 kids and in grades 6, 7, and 8, and they had to apply. It was like a job application. I have they could be an advertising specialist, a promotion specialist, a merchandising specialist, an archivist, and there's about 3 or 4 other jobs that they could do, and they apply for which ones they want to do, and we meet during lunches, and I don't really need a lot of parent volunteers when I have my student crew because they are very excited and very dedicated and motivated, and that's really all I need for my book fair to run successfully. Wow. And we have our book fair for the winter coming up in exactly 2 weeks from today. Mm-hmm. And so we had applications due last Monday, and I have 30 kids signed up to be part of my book crew this year. So it has grown. It's doubled in size. We're going to be making T-shirts this year with them. So it's just, again, another way to just spread that excitement, and it becomes not just like a book fair, but an event. And it's just, the energy is electric throughout the school for that. So those are 2 things I do in conjunction with direct school-wide culture of reading. And then I also do have a pretty active makerspace. So my makerspace is one in which it's It's kind of a tinkering area. There's not a lot of set projects that students have to do when they come. And I have been working on connecting it more with curriculum so that classroom teachers can connect what they're doing in their classrooms to the stuff, makerspace materials that I have, and kind of developing that maker mindset. Because the one thing that I'll say about makerspace is it's not about the stuff, it's about the teaching and the learning and how that changes when you bring a makerspace mindset into your school. And I've been really working on trying to make more direct connections with literacy. So I don't have a lot of tangible things with that yet, but that's something that I'm really trying to grow and build as I continue to be in this school.
Well, I know that our ISD did some neat lessons for a makerspace using children's books, children's picture books as inspiration.
Awesome.
And so I can actually, I haven't done a makerspace episode yet, but it definitely is in the works. But I can include a link to some of those. They use picture books. And it's neat because you as a librarian, I buy the picture books and then we do that curricular tie-in with the makerspace. I am curious because you mentioned this collaboration piece with your teachers when it comes to makerspace. What do you do? I'm looking at it sort of which comes first. They come to you with makerspace ideas or you go to them with makerspace ideas?
So far, it has been, you know what, I don't really know which direction it often goes. Probably now 2, maybe 3 years ago, I was able to get part of a PD afternoon to meet with all of the teachers and kind of go over what exactly is this thing called Makerspace. So they had a little bit more background knowledge. And I asked them to fill out a Padlet, and I asked them what their favorite units were to teach and what their least favorite units were to teach so that I could kind of get some ideas of the content that they were having to work with and also the areas that they weren't so excited about. I thought maybe I could interject some makerspace fun sort of into that. And actually, as a result of that PD, I had the Chinese teacher come to me about 3 days later with an idea. So she approached me with that idea, and we actually did paper dolls. They were learning the vocabulary for clothing in her class, and they came in and they worked in groups and they made 5 very unique and different paper dolls that they then had to create labels for to describe their clothing. So that's one example. And then one example where I approached the teacher was in 6th grade. They do a unit on immigration and with oral history. And so I teach the beginning lesson on what is oral history and why do historians use it, because I am a former social studies teacher and it is one of my passions. And I love to be able to connect still with students on topics like that. And then I had them at the end of their unit, they would interview somebody, they would collect an oral history experience story, they would transcribe it as best as they could, and then they would come to the makerspace and we would create suitcases out of cardboard boxes. Any of the materials I had a lot of maps that were donated, so a lot of us wrapped up our boxes in maps. And then their task was to identify 3 items that represented their person's experience. And it was more of like a collaging thing. So some kids had actual artifacts that they would bring and then they would share when they would present. But a lot of them would just we would find images. They would bring in photos or we would look in magazines. That was one way that I used some weeded books. I have a really hard time getting rid of my weeded books. It's something I'm working on. But like the old country books that are out of date or I have multiple copies of, I weeded them out of my collection, but then I brought them out for that project. And I had students, if their person was from Paraguay, I would have them look in the Paraguay book and see if there was anything that connected with the story that they could then cut out and use on their suitcase.
Well, and I have to just jump in because what you mentioned about the weeding of the country books, that's what I'm doing right now. I'm going in my country books and it's embarrassing because nothing can compete with a database. Anything in my collection is sadly outdated now, but you mentioned the photos. The photos would still be something we could use.
Right.
And my makerspace is part of our library. I could move those books over and then talk to the social studies teacher about cutting them up. And it is a challenge because oftentimes teachers, when they see books, they say, oh no, we'll use them for research. And I say,
know.
oh, no. But we can use the pictures for collaging for our country expo. That's outstanding. Yeah. I like the strategy also you mentioned of asking teachers for the thing that which they would love help with.
Right.
I think we all gravitate towards the lessons we're proud of, we're excited about, and the ones that we really just aren't excited about, we sort of move through quickly. But as a collaborator, if you could support them and give them a reason to get excited about something by bringing in fresh new ideas.
Right, exactly.
I really think that that's a great trick. So very cool. Sorry to interrupt. And I didn't want to leave those kids hanging at your book fair. I think what's fun about that is you're giving the kids one more reason to be invested in you and your program.
Right.
This is now because they consider themselves, but they're part of the team. What comes out of that book fair is tangible. They will see all the good that comes from that fundraiser and maybe even give them some buy-in and say, this is what we were able to, I wouldn't get into specifics about money, but suggesting, given that we were able to raise money for the library, what would you have me invest in to make this library more a place you want to be and visit?
Yeah, and one little side note of that too is if you do a Scholastic book fair, they have something called All for Books. Mm-hmm. And it took me 3 years to figure out what that even was about because I was overwhelmed with the process kind of in general for the first few years. But what All for Books is it's an organization that Scholastic supports that for all the money you raise to go towards that cause, people can donate whatever they want and you can ask them to round up. So if it's $7.50, would you like to round up to $8? That 50 cents goes into the All for Books fund. Not only does the school get to spend the money on books on the fair for their school, Scholastic matches it and donates it to different places that are in need of money for books. And it started, from what I understand, maybe back during Hurricane Katrina, when all of the libraries were destroyed in New Orleans. And they match up to $1 million every year. So that's something that I also really stress with the students about that service learning piece, that through our work here, we can make a difference in other places.
Oh, I love that. And it's sort of making what you're doing locally having a global impact.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's great. I would love to ask you, if I'm not mistaken, when you and I first met online, you listened to my episode on classroom libraries, rivals or partners.
Yes.
And I'm concerned I might have just lost listeners after that episode. I at some point I expressed some rather strong opinions about classroom libraries. I'd like to think I have evolved. Like many topics, if you spend long enough thinking about them, you can see the nuance. But I'd love to hear what you have to say about classroom libraries, because this is another opportunity to build the school-wide culture of reading, and clearly I'm missing that.
And I think that is, when I listened to it, I was doing a lot of digging deeper into how I, as the school librarian, could help classroom teachers build up their school libraries. And so that I found that, and I was like, oh my gosh. And then I did listen, and it was interesting to hear another perspective. And I come from a classroom teacher perspective for 12 years. And I was kind of always my school librarian, no matter what. And my previous position, we did not have a school library where I was. And that was how I became a librarian. And that's a whole nother podcast probably. But I was building a school library and wanted to be official at the school. So got my certification that year, and then things changed in the district. And I then had to find a new position. And that's where I ended up as a full-time middle school librarian. And it was the best accident that I think that has happened in my career. But I think that it is such an important piece that in a middle school specifically, that all teachers consider themselves readers and that all teachers consider themselves teachers of literacy. And I know that that isn't always the case in middle and high school. And so, and I also have, it's not a problem, but it's like my Twitter handle, it's bookitis. I have so many books everywhere that I need to get them out of where I am and out into the hands of readers. And so I often will just gift classroom teachers a small pile of books on my passing by, because that weekend I went to a secondhand store or a tag sale, or I found, like, I don't know how I find them, but I find them everywhere. And I do think also that classroom teachers sometimes appreciate the help, and their libraries are outdated, and they get the stuff that is left over or that they got with the classroom when they started teaching there. And I think part of my responsibility as an informed reader and up to date of what should be in classrooms and maybe what should be discussed and taken out of classrooms, I can offer some professional expertise in that area. So I just think that the more books kids see, the more likely they are to pick them up. And if there's competition, I think it's healthy competition. Because I know a lot of librarians are worried that if their libraries in the classrooms are so robust, then they're not going to see anybody come into their space. And I don't see that happening if you have a culture of reading. So that's part of my opinion. It's not fully formed, but one of the things that's connected to my endeavor in helping teachers just become aware that they should have a classroom library, even if you're a math teacher, because in our school, everybody has an advisory. And I want kids to see that the math teacher is a reader. And during conference week, I had a build your stack party in the library, and I had used some funds from the language arts department at the end of last year that had not been spent yet. They actually had a line for classroom libraries. And I don't know if that's still there this year, but they asked if I would look and purchase books. And I'm like, of course I will, because that's one of my favorite things to do. And so between that and some Scholastic club book orders and my Scholastic dollars, I put together a pretty large quantity of books, and teachers got to come and build their bag and bring them back to their classroom libraries. And I had probably 75% of the teachers come through, and it was so exciting. And we took pictures, and we were going to use the green screen, and we're going to make reading posters with them and their bags and their huge smiles, and we're going to post those up around the school. So
I really like that. I remember seeing Build Your Stack, and I will be honest, the first time I saw that, I said, my God, all those books have to be reshelved now. And that was when each of the graduating kids, or at the end of the year, you could build your stack and take a picture of it. And
yes.
I'm a little too pragmatic, and I was just like, my God, that's a lot of books to shelve. But
Yes.
I love the idea of doing that with your staff.
Yeah.
Because I think that, and having the posters around the building, because I think that message of reading, when it is repeated and consistent across, it shows the students, and those along with those posters on people's doors that say what I'm reading,
Yes.
using like a Bitmoji, and Miss Thom is reading, and putting the cover of it. It really does convey to the kids this consistent message that reading is part of our everyday, irrespective of the subject matter that we teach.
Absolutely. Yep.
I think that's fantastic. I do know that there are teachers who really need to learn about weeding.
Right.
And I think, because I didn't teach elementary school, but what I've heard from my teachers is, well, I don't know what I'm teaching next year, so I don't want to throw anything out. So this idea that if your class assignment gets changed and your grade level changes, you don't want to relinquish any books, because you might have to teach that grade, and you want to have a variety of books depending on what your teaching assignment is the next year.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and it, like you said, it goes back to just educating what is a quality book now. So, and one of the things that I know, we're going to talk a little bit about book tasting coming up in a little bit. And one of the people that I co-present on that topic with, Jen Slifer, she is adamant. She is a reading specialist. And she is adamant that classroom libraries should be up to date. The books should be There should always be some new books because every child reader deserves a new book in their life. And the idea that books that we loved as readers when we were young, like the nostalgia that comes from that, doesn't necessarily mean it should be in our classroom libraries. And so the idea of what do we look for, and how then once we take these outdated and messed up books off of our shelves, well, how do we fill them back up? Because that's a real issue. And we know that classroom teachers and educators in general spend a lot of their own money. And that's kind of, again, where I can come in, and I kind of have some tricks on how to find a lot of books for not a lot of money, and just getting those books into those classrooms. And one of the tools that I share with teachers to help them kind of figure out what is their library representative of all of the students, not only in their class, but in our society, in our world, because we talk about, the windows, the mirrors, and the sliding glass doors. Lee and Low Publishers has amazing resources, and they have a classroom checklist, like a classroom library checklist, to go through and analyze your classroom library. You could use it on a school library level, but it's more designed for classroom libraries. And just to kind of get them having some thoughts and some conversations about, well, what kind of books do we have? Are they predominantly books that were written in the 80s? Were they predominantly books that were written by white authors? Do we have any diversity on any level in our titles on our shelves? And I do think that is a conversation that the librarian can really start to facilitate if it's not already being had at your school.
Well, and I think that it's reasonable to assume that on some level, yes, it's nostalgia that is the reason why many of these books remain on the shelves. And I know that it's oftentimes an impediment for librarians when we're trying to weed our own collections. But unfortunately, the sad truth is not all grade level teachers continue to read at their students' grade level once they are in the classroom.
Yes, that is so true. And I don't have a really surefire solution to that. Mm-hmm. But it was last week. It was election day. We had a completely district PD. Everybody in our district was at the high school. And as a school, we had to go into a classroom at the end of the day and debrief. And we were talking about some of the takeaways that we had done or we had from some of the sessions. And it was all about cultural competency. And it was a variety of subjects and topics. And we started to talk a little bit about the session that I had done with a couple of other librarians about why it's so important that our readers see themselves in the books that we put in their hands, especially when it's connected to curriculum. And we had a short conversation. And then my principal, this was so powerful. My principal said, and you just need to read the books that the kids are reading. Like, he said that at the end of that meeting. And I didn't really pay attention to it at first. And the more that I thought about it on my way home, I was like, that is such a simple message, but coming from the principal, I think that it has much more power. And I really hope that seed kind of is planted for some of the teachers who might not be reading books that are at the age level of what our students are reading as well.
Right. I know that with because I'm at the elementary level, I know that a lot of my teachers become familiar with these books through their read alouds. So when they decide to do a classroom read aloud, then they are becoming familiar with the books at grade level. However, it is... you don't oftentimes meet middle school teachers who read middle grade just for fun or YA just for fun. I've been a librarian for 13 years. I haven't read a big people book, an adult book in years because I'm still trying to catch up on the fact I wasn't raised a reader. I really, truly have a great deal of reading I need to do to just stay current with my students. But I see that as part of my job.
Right. As do I, definitely.
Yeah, that's definitely part of my job. Let's transition to book tastings because I really want to learn about that. Friends, we'll include a link in our show notes. Tell us about these thematic book clubs.
Well, it's I know a lot of librarians out there listening are probably familiar and may have done them themselves, but it's one other way to essentially do book talks. So I have quite a few of my teachers who do thematic units, and they'll say, Melissa, we're starting a fantasy unit and we want the kids to be able to choose an independent reading book within that genre. So what I will do is I will work to create different themes kind of within fantasy, and we'll set up the library or the classroom depending on what situation we find ourselves in. And I use tablecloths and I use little lights that have batteries, and those are all thanks to Shannon McNeese over at Sedgwick, the other middle school. She shares her resources. We even have little flowers, like little glass vases with plastic flowers. We kind of set the mood, and we make it so that it's an event. You are going to be experiencing and sampling all these different types of books within whatever genre or theme that we're working with. And you're going to try to find 2 or 3 that kind of pique your interest. And one of the fun things that we've added, and it will be on the link that you share with the audience, we have a little a paper that kind of looks like a check that they can then record the titles that just stuck out to them the most. And what often happens is the teacher and we are very excited about the books that we share. And we just do kind of 30-second little book talks, kind of sprinkling around the tables depending on how they're set up. And we talk about books we've read. We talk about books that we are attracted to because of the cover. We talk about books that we've read the blurb and we say, this is really interesting to me because we kind of model the strategies that a reader uses in order to choose a book that they are interested in reading at that time. So on the website that I've created, I think I have a list of books that are for fantasy, for memoir, and then there's 4 really big comprehensive lists that include 4 different themes. So one I think is overcoming challenges. One is all about like empathy and understanding other people. One is, I can't think of the other 2, but there's 4 of them. And that's the presentation that I did put that together for a presentation that I did about 2 years ago. And I have done those book tastings at different points throughout for my 6th, 7th, and 8th graders.
Well, and I think what I like is that there is this, it's very intentional and it's very planned. This isn't just whipped together in a matter of minutes. I know I had a teacher text me at lunch today about strong protagonist books, and I had about 15 minutes, put it together. I said, send the kids up now before my class comes.
Wow.
And, but again, it's harried, it's not planful, and, it's very just sort of solving that problem at the minute, but it doesn't give the kids this invitation to consume and relax and really sort of delve into these books and give them that sort of permission. And I imagine the first time they try it is very different from the 4th or 5th time they come to do one of these book clubs with you.
And it is definitely, because like what you said, I feel like when students are asked to choose what to read, it's like, do it as fast as you can and get back.
Right.
Like you said, especially when they send kids just to the library and be like, I need to find a book. Well, okay. But it's like customer service. You have to apply that strategy, and you have to know your reader, and you have to ask them probing questions, and then you can like cater it to what you think that they're going to really enjoy. So the most recent one we did was a couple, maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago. 7th grade does a memoir biography unit. And so I pulled the ones that I thought would be of really high interest, and I put them into groups, and I kind of group them kind of subject based. So like there might be politics, there might be sports, there might be like maybe time periods like World War II or Holocaust or battles within World War II. So I try to kind of make subject connections as well, because that's kind of how students, I think, if they can connect the biography or memoir with something that they are interested in from somewhere else in their life, it's going to be something that's just much more meaningful, as opposed to randomly grabbing a book off the shelf and saying, check, I got my memoir, and going back to class.
Yeah. Now, this, I hadn't planned on asking you this, but it occurred to me just now that there's a possibility we have an entire generation that, at least in my community, is growing up without bookstores in our community. We had we had a Barnes and Noble and a Borders within half a mile of our entire district. And those are since been gone in the last 5 years.
Oh my gosh.
My students do not have the opportunity to go through a bookstore and just peruse. And that's something which was a part of my life growing up. And we didn't always buy books, but I remember going through a bookstore and then my mother would say, I bet they have that book at the library. But still, it was something relaxing to do. And if your community doesn't have that bookstore, then the opportunities, I'm sorry, the last time I perused books was at Sam's Club. And there's nothing particularly relaxing about that.
Right. And that's such an important point you bring up, because I don't know if it was 2015, 2014. Are you familiar with the article from, it's going to escape me now, but it was about book deserts.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And so that when you mention that, it makes me think of the work of Jared Amato and Project Lit, which is something also that people can look up if they're not familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And he was really concerned. He was in Nashville in that area, and his ninth graders, that they did kind of a survey of, I don't know what the radius from their school, but they didn't find any bookstores. They didn't find really too much for libraries either. And he wanted to know, like, where do people get their books? And the answer was they just really didn't. So he started some work with his ninth graders to try to solve this problem. And you can kind of look up more about what he did to kind of work that out. But eventually they came up with something called Project Lit that is national now, and it is everywhere you look. But it is a very important talking point that as librarians, I think we need to somehow continue to address the issue that there are book deserts in way too many places in our country. Mm-hmm. And what do we do about that?
Well, and then to the point, all the more reason to have school classroom, not just classroom libraries, but obviously school libraries, and having that immediacy for our students. Could I ask you about you mentioned I've seen on Twitter, you use the hashtag Schoolwide culture of reading. Yes. Can you tell me how that helps you connect with with others who are working towards this effort?
Yeah. So when that came out of it, I don't know if I'm the one that did it first or not, but it was based on the webinar that I had done last November for School Library Connection on this topic. And I just wanted to try to get some thoughts and share some resources and ideas and continue the conversation after the webinar was over. And so I would share out some things and use this hashtag. And since I started doing that, every time I share something having to do with culture of reading, I just put that hashtag on there because it is a way to organize. And if I have somebody that asks me, well, what are some of the things that you suggest to do for school-wide culture of reading? I will point them in this direction if they are on Twitter. And I think it's a way that it's how we find our people in the Twitter sphere is by those hashtags. And people who are new to Twitter or not really sure whether or not they really want to be on Twitter, they're a little intimidated and they don't understand how the hashtags can be really powerful. It's something that's a learning curve, but once you kind of get into the flow, there is really no question that will go unanswered if you put it out to your Twitter community once you build up a really strong base. So the hashtag hasn't connected me with too many individuals yet because I don't know that it's really caught on, but I think that it will definitely continue to grow. And I've actually talked about it. It's funny you asked about it because I've talked about it twice in the last couple of weeks. I just had 2 librarians visit from a neighboring district to talk about school-wide culture of reading just today. So this is definitely a topic that is out there, and librarians and teachers are hungry for it. There were a few presentations on this topic at AASL about bringing literacy to your entire community. So I think this is definitely something that is resurging. I mean, I've only been in the field for 5 years officially, but it seems to be pretty pervasive.
Sure. I will. I do want to ask you because you do have a blog. You have a website, The Joyful Teacher Librarian, and I've included a link in the show notes. Could you give listeners an idea of what kinds of resources they would find at your blog?
Yeah, and it is definitely a blog that is always under construction. It was a way for me to get as much as I could out of my head and out to other people. It was a way to try to organize all of this stuff that I love to learn about and try to share it with a wider audience. So I've started to put some information up there about Twitter, about how to use it, some tips, who to follow to get started, some suggestions of how to get more connected to the community in which you are trying to connect yourself with, to avoid just the stuff you don't really want to see and be a part of on the Twitter, in the Twitter world. I also have a page for Schoolwide Culture of Reading where I've tried to kind of keep a lot of the materials that I use throughout my professional life and just with my teachers at my school. Kind of a storehouse. So I think you will find, I'm pretty sure it's still active, the recording of the webinar that I did last November for School Library Connection. There's also a link on there for the EdWeb webinar that I got to do with Michelle Ludala last April during Library Month for EdWeb on culture of literacy. And I'm always trying to add, and as you know, when school starts, it's a very busy time, and a lot of new content does not go up during the school year. Yeah. So it's usually during the summer that I really try to coalesce everything that kind of happened over the year and get it up there. But definitely check it out. And if there's stuff that you're looking for that you can find, just send me an email. And if there's something that's not on there at all and you think it would be useful, let me know, because I am happy to build content with whatever the librarians need. And it's joyful because our job should be joyful. And I'm trying to bring the joy back to education, at least in my sphere, because it's just not joyful for too many people. So.
Oh, no, I think you are not alone. I think that if there's one thing I've learned about librarians from this podcast, is that all of us are being pulled in many, many different directions because our job, it requires us to. We are being spread incredibly thin. But I do have to say, don't you get snow days out there in Connecticut? How many days did you miss last year for the polar vortex and the cold days?
Well, actually, last year was amazing. I think we only had 2 or 3 days we had to make up.
Wow.
It was the year before that we were in school till June 21st.
Oh, I'm
not
sorry.
Cool.
Do you not build in certain days? Like we have 5 days built into our calendar, and we can miss up to 5 days, and beyond that, then it becomes complicated. And if the state declares if the governor declares a state of emergency, those dates will not count.
Oh,
towards
that's wonderful.
So we've become very well versed. We had 5 polar vortex days. I got a lot of work done on my podcast during the polar vortex. Yes. Do tell me about School Library Journal's Leadership Base Camp, because I learned about it while I was on your blog.
So I think maybe it's been happening for 3, maybe 4 years. And it was my first experience of being able to share my passion and ideas for Schoolwide Culture of Reading. And School Library Journal also does a leadership summit, and it's kind of using that metaphor of the base camp is meant to kind of prepare you for what is coming in the journey. And then the leadership summit, which often happens in September or October, is kind of like you are with, I don't know, 200 to 300 of the most dynamic librarians you're ever going to meet all in one place. So when I did the base camp, I think it's almost 3 years ago now, I was invited to present, and they asked what I wanted to present on, and I really didn't know. I had done a lot with maker spaces, and I had done a lot with like Social Studies History Day. And she said, well, what about culture of reading? And I said, what about culture of reading? And that was the first time that I really thought about it as a presentation topic, because it was always just something that I did. It was ingrained into my work as a classroom teacher first, and then as a school librarian now. And that was really my jump off point. And that led to so many different things. And my mind has completely expanded. And that for the last 2 years now has really been one of my primary focuses at my school and in my program, is just this whole idea of school-wide culture of reading.
I want to, you've got so many fantastic ideas, and listeners, I'll make sure to include links in the show notes so that you have the opportunity to explore not just the blog, but also the presentations that you have given. Before we go, do you have any other advice for school librarians who are looking to build a community of school-wide reader culture in their buildings?
Yeah, I kind of have 3 main suggestions whenever I start a presentation. The first one is to set both small and large goals, short-term and long-term, and know that you are not going to be able to do everything that you want at once. That is definitely the mantra of a librarian. And we focus often on what we are not doing and what we don't have time for, but really just focus on all the wonderful things you are doing, because you are doing amazing things out there. All of us are doing amazing things. So really kind of pick some small things that you can do tomorrow after listening to this podcast. Get your teachers to put a sign on the outside of their door about what they're currently reading. Something as small as that. And then the second piece of advice is try your best to avoid that squirrel mentality. And I am so guilty of this in so many aspects of my life. I am so excited about a variety of things, and I hear about something new and I want to drop everything and dive deeply into that right now. I've trained myself to write it down somewhere, let it marinate for a while, and when the time is right, it will come back to the surface, and I'll be able to fully kind of develop that idea at a later time. And then the third, and to me is the most important, is to focus on the positive. Find the positive people that are in your building. And that might not be your administrator. That might not be even the person maybe you work with directly if you have a co-librarian. Find the people that are passionate about the topic and really try to connect with them and bring them into your thoughts and your ideas. And that small enthusiasm will grow into a bigger thing, because my first year at my school was nothing like my 5th year at my school. And I know that a lot of you have to travel between buildings, and that relationship building can be truly, truly challenging. But again, focusing on the positive and what you are doing and less on what you aren't doing.
Wow. I can't thank you enough. It is, you mentioned, you remind us, how busy it is once the school year starts. But I'll tell you, the fact is that listeners are going to be able to appreciate this podcast when it's convenient for them, when they're driving to work, when they're walking the dogs or emptying the dishwasher. And truly, friends, the idea is when we share out these ideas, the nice thing is that the show notes will be there for you to revisit. And it really is great because you can have this personalized PD whenever you like. Would you, Melissa, tell us where we can follow you on social media? Just because I know that I've learned a great deal from following you.
Definitely. So my Twitter and Instagram handle is Miss Thom Bookitis, and it's MSTHOM and then Bookitis. You can find me on Facebook. It's Joyful Teacher Librarian. And if you have trouble finding me, go to my webpage and I have a direct link to it, or just send me an email. And my email is joyfullearning@melissathom.com. So please reach out. I love to meet new people and share ideas. So I hope to hear from a lot of you in the future.
Oh, well, I hope you have a great holiday, and thank you so much for this evening.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
I'd like to extend a very special thank you to Melissa Thom for her resources and her strategies, and for making this episode so meaningful to our listeners. If you'd like to learn more about anything that was discussed today, please be sure to check out our show notes. If you found this episode useful, consider sharing it with your PLN, your department, and on social media. The topic of our next episode will be Coding and Collaboration, and my interview with Kelly Hinks. I hope you will tune in.